Hello, friends. So, as we start this morning, I'm going to ask you a question that maybe you've considered before. Maybe you've been led through an exercise about it. Uh, have you done this thing where you talk about your life purpose, or perhaps you create a life mission statement, a personal mission statement, something like that? I've probably done at least five of these in my life. And so I would guess for at least a few of you, maybe several of you, or most of you, you've done something like this in your life. Um, the, Usually, what this does is it says there are a lot of things you do. Uh, that's the what of your life. All of this happens in your life, and your life purpose. This personal mission statement, if you will, it's the why. Why do you do what you do? Um, And people write things down like my mission is to make the world a more beautiful place through art and loving relationships, which is a nice and beautiful thing. This is a good thing to aspire to with our lives. I'm going to ask you to stop right here at the beginning. And if you're gathering with a group of people, hit pause and have some conversation about this. Have you gone through any sort of life mission statement, personal mission sort of exercise, and how do you see it for yourself? So hit pause, have that conversation. Okay, and if you are still with me right now and you haven't hit pause, you need to now. But now I'm going to go ahead and move on. So long before any of these personal mission statements came in vogue, the church was asking these kinds of questions and asking them in a slightly different way. We didn't just have blanks for everyone to fill in their own answers. Instead, when the church asked these questions, we had certain responses that we said were for all of us. Some of them go like this. The Westminster Catechism, for instance, it says, "What is the chief end of man?" And this is written at a time that when you hear man, they are talking about all people. God created male and female, and in the image of God, He created both of them. And so, whenever you hear male and he here, they're referring to all of us. What is the chief end of man? It asks, and it says, "Man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever." It essentially says you already have a life purpose. You already have that life mission. It's given to you. You don't need to fill in any blanks. What you maybe need to do is decide within who you are and your particular situations. What does it look like for you to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever? But we already know that this is the personal mission statement. It's everyone's. This is what you're made for. Or the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church, it says it a bit differently. It says, "Of all visible creatures, only man," again, only man as male and female, "is able to know and love his Creator. He is the only creature on earth that God has willed for its own sake, and he alone is called to share by knowledge and love in God's own life. It was for this end that he was created, and this is the fundamental reason for his dignity." So, why were you created? To know God, to love God, and you are able to know and love God in a way that the other creatures of this earth aren't, and it's a fundamental reason for your dignity. This is who you are at core and what you're made for. And so we see the church answering these questions. And what we see in our passage today, I think, gives us another version of that, and one that actually I've clung to to the Westminster, to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. But I wonder if what we're getting in today's passage maybe is even better. The question that Jesus is asked is about which is the greatest of all of God's commandments. Um, and it gives us kind of a question like asking a parent, which is your favorite kid? Or a dog owner, which is their favorite dog? I don't think we've ever asked cat owners a question like this. There's no need to ask a cat owner about their favorite cat. But this question about, so which is most important? God has spoken all of these things. What's most important to him? And here's the trap. All of God's teaching, it should be viewed as equally great. This is something that some people would hold up. Like, as soon as you name one, what are you putting it above all the rest as more important? Like, if you have to choose between following this command and this command, how do you choose which one you follow? If you just follow one of the commands, is that enough? Because it was the most important one, and so you followed it really well. And so the trap is that, well, we should view all of this as great and important. And if God has said it, then it's important to God and it needs to be heeded. So if we hold one teaching above all the rest, there's this possibility of negating or minimizing all of the other words that have come from God. And so I want to make two really big observations here about what Jesus does, and then we'll consider these more carefully. And the first one is this. Notice what this doesn't say. When Jesus responds to this, he doesn't simply respond that there's this greatest commandment and that nothing else matters. Jesus doesn't say, love God and love people, nothing else matters. Instead, what Jesus says is, everything hangs on these two commandments. These are the why of all of the other commandments. Does this make any of the other commandments less important? No. It gives them their full meaning. It gives you the right lens for understanding the rest of the commandments. It's not that Jesus is saying there's no need to observe the rest. In fact, he says almost the opposite of that. That here's the reason that you observe every other commandment God has given you, is because they hang on these two. Every commandment you've been given, well, it's about loving God and it's about loving your neighbor. And so this becomes a key for all of our Bible reading. When you read the Bible and you see anything that God has spoken, I'll say to you that if there's a command in it, if God is telling us to act, to behave in any particular way, the only way for us to understand that properly is to understand it as something that has to do with loving God or loving our neighbor, or both of them together. And so read all of the Old Testament commands, and you might read some and say, how is this about love of God or love of neighbor? And I want to just claim for you, I believe it is. And we have to keep searching until we see how this hangs on love of God and love of neighbor before we really understand that. Without these, all of the rest of the commands, they lack their foundation. They lack, here, as Jesus says it, they lack what they're hanging on, and they fall when they're all by themselves. This is where, so 1 Corinthians 13, one of our favorite passages talking about love, and it says, look, if I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, if I do all of these things, but if I do not have love, well, then I'm a resounding gong, I'm a clanging cymbal. That if you follow all of the commands of God, except these two, if you do all of the rest, but you do not have love, you don't have any of it, because you cut them off from their real source. And that's why they're the greatest. Not because they're the only ones that matter, but because everything else hangs on these. So, first big thing, it doesn't say that nothing else matters. Everything else matters even more because of these. Here's the second thing that I think it's important for us to notice it does not say. This does not say that loving God equals loving your neighbor, or that loving your neighbor equals loving God. There have been certain groups of people in the church that have given so much attention to personal piety, to just loving God, that they seem to entirely ignore any idea of loving neighbor. And I would say that it's done real harm to the Christian witness in the world, because the world sees people who claim to love God and yet have no love for God's creatures. We have a friend who was turned away from the church particularly because she says, my grandmother is one of the most pious people I know. In the church, at the church, any chance she could get, she follows any of its guidance and commands about how she should live toward God. And she is also one of the meanest, most unkind people I know. And this turns her away from the church. There's this love of God that then seemed entirely disconnected from a love of other people. Uh, we also can't do this. We can't simply say, the way that I will love God is by loving my neighbor, as if we can just replace God with the people around us. That's a notion that misses that God is more than the people around you. God is other. God is separate from all of the people around you. God is with us, and we can see God in others, but God is also distinct. And some of these notions that we can just love God by loving other people, well, they end up equating our faith with something far less than what God intends here, which is for us to know Him, for us to know a divine creator. And with that, let's talk about this first part. I want to say a few more things about it. Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. He doesn't just say love God. He says, love the Lord your God. That is, he's talking about a particular God, a God with a history. This is the God who created us. This is the God who formed and rescued Israel. This is a personal God, your God. And what that means is we have a God who we have a history with, a God who first loved us. So this love that God commands here, it's not just for us to garner out of ourselves this great love for God. It's an answering love. It's a responding love. We're not commanded to love some distant great being, some generic God. We're commanded to love the God who first loved us, who first created us, who first cared for us. And God says, now with your whole heart and soul and mind, love me. Here's why this is also important. A generic God. So sometimes we can ask questions about how we would love God that end up focusing on, well, what do I perceive as the best way of showing that I love God and neighbor? And when we do that, we deny that God has already acted, has already spoken, that our God is a God who already makes claims on our lives. And instead we act like there's a generic God, and what do we think that God would want? What do we think that God would be like? So great public theologian named Mark Sayers. You've heard me quote him probably a few times if you've been around here for a while. Here's what he says about us really changing some of our views of God in today's culture. He says what we're experiencing is not the eradication of God from the Western mind, but rather the enthroning of the self as the greatest authority. He says we've kind of gotten okay with having this God so long as ourselves can end up becoming the greatest authority. He says God is increasingly relegated to the role of servant and massager of the personal will. We will find that progressive contemporary Western culture is shaped by an ancient heresy, and that's this heresy known as Gnosticism. And he said Gnosticism at its heart is an alternate gospel which moves authority from God to the self, in which the individual seeks to power their own development and salvation. Here's the difference between loving the Lord your God, the Lord Yahweh, who rescued Israel from Egypt, who spoke to them and who continues to speak, The difference between that and loving a generic God is that generic God ends up, that generic God ends up sounding a whole lot like ourselves. That we end up just enthroning ourselves and saying, what do I believe would be right? What do I believe would be good? And surely that's what a good God would believe too. And we make God no different from ourselves and give ourselves all of the authority. And so the kind of love that is commanded here, well, it does something pretty important in our lives and in the world. To love God, actually, what the scriptures tell us over and over again is this is love of God, to keep his commandments. This is one of the brilliant pieces about Jesus' answer here. What's the greatest commandment? And he says, love the Lord your God. And then frequently throughout the scriptures, we say, well, how do we love the Lord our God? And it says, by keeping his commandments. So what's the greatest commandment? The commandment to keep all of God's commandments, in some sense, is what this begins to say to us. If you really love God, you will listen to him and keep his commandments. And God's commandments, what they frequently counsel, especially regarding our personal lives, is restraint where the world grants freedom. It's restraint where we could convince ourselves that more freedom would be a fine and godly response. I think for myself, just even about the Ten Commandments. And those commandments, as we see them in the Old Testament, and then as Jesus teaches about them, and I think about the ways that I can so easily convince myself that I should have more freedom. When God counsels some restraint, when they say things like, you shall have no other gods before me, which that for a Christian who says God must be first, we can't have idols, that sounds pretty plain and simple, but I recognize the number of times that another allegiance will claim my heart, will claim my desires, will claim my interests. The scriptures frequently talk about mammon, money, as this great idol that we can find ourselves serving. And shouldn't I be free to gain what I want, to acquire what I want, to use what I want? And it can take this place in our lives where it replaces God as our greatest allegiance and our greatest focus and our greatest desire. You shall have no other gods before me, despite all of the other things that the world puts in front of you as things to desire. God commands us to honor the Sabbath. He says, take 6 days to do all your work. And there are, frankly, just times for me that I don't think I can do that. I have too much. As if, and so then the question for me is, did God really ever mean it? Did God mean it back then and just not now for me? And I can rationalize all of the different ways for myself that, well, maybe they just didn't have as much work to do then. They didn't have as much going on. They could rest, but it's just not a reality in our world today. And, here's the thing. Every time I do it, I think a piece of what I'm doing is I'm moving authority from God to myself, and I am trying to find the way to claim that I should have this freedom from God's commands when God has said, no, honor the Sabbath, 6 days to do all your work. And so the seventh day, keep it holy and rest from all of your work. And I chafe at these. You shall not murder. That has not been a direct challenge to me until I then hear Jesus say, and when you burn with anger, it is murder in your heart. And when you burn with anger and deny someone else dignity, then it is a great problem. And there's this challenge for me. Can I be a person who does not burn with anger and desire bad things or harbor resentment toward other people?